Neil Armstrong. Join me for an adventure through time. The first German air attacks of the Second World War destroyed most of the old biplane fighters. Pilots from Britain, France, and Holland fell from the sky at an alarming rate. Only the Hurricane and Spitfire survived the initial onslaught. Overnight, the monoplane became the standard for new design. Once again, there was a ferocious battle for speed. The first plane to reach the target won, and the pilots with the quickest reflexes were the...
of France to Hitler. Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons, said, "The Battle of France is over. To begin, the whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be to break us in this island, or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free. But if we fail, then the whole world cared for will sink." Winston Churchill's fear of the rising threat of Germany, and especially the Luftwaffe, was not gone. Their showpiece was the Bf-109. Designed by Willy Messerschmitt, the 109 was a small airframe built around a powerful engine. An 1,100 horsepower Daimler-Benz engine gave her a phenomenal top speed of 354 miles per hour. Spanish Civil War, the German 109 showed that speed kills. Carrying both machine guns and cannons, she outflew and outgunned any biplane put against her. Faced with the challenge of the Luftwaffe, the race was on for Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, 12-cylinder rated to successful planes. She was well balanced. She was also 35 miles per hour slower than a 109. When the war started, the Hurricane fighters. An engine was created by race. Mitchell's design featured unusually thin wings. This 155 miles per hour. Called the Spitfire, the British finally had a plane that was equal in speed.
Wins its battle stripes when first flights get...
Based on the design of a racing seaplane, the Spitfire arrived on the scene just in time to help wage the Battle of Britain. In the early days, the Spitfire was a pilot's nightmare. Not properly tested, it developed dozens of teething problems, and its slow speed during takeoff and landing was almost uncontrollable. It was the first of a generation of aircraft that received its final testing under fire.
Reminiscing on the Spitfire, RAF pilot John Nesbitt Dufort, DSO, described his first flight in a Model Mark I. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the throttle fully open. Speed built up surprisingly quickly, and we were airborne before I realized it. She went around as though she had been on rails. The little plane handled beautifully. On August 10th, the Luftwaffe began attacking airfields throughout southern England. Attacks were constant and almost succeeded in destroying the RAF. In just 2 weeks, Britain lost 466 fighters and 1/4 of its pilots. Almost any young man who could fly a plane was put into the air against the Germans, being told to keep up and to watch for the Hun in the sun. Many young men were lost just from the sheer confusion of trying to fly an unfamiliar plane while watching for the enemy and engaging in dogfights. Wing Commander Jeffrey Page was one of the many who experienced losing his aircraft. Of that day, he said, "I couldn't believe I'd been hit." 2 more bangs followed in quick succession. The gas tank behind the engine blew up, and my cockpit became an inferno. My fear became blind terror, then agonizing horror, as the bare skin of my hands gripping the throttle shriveled up like burnt parchment. In a dogfight, the 109 was a serious challenge. Her fuel-injected engine allowed her to maneuver freely without losing power. But the additional wing surface of the Hurricane and Spitfire allowed them to outturn the 109. Turning was the key that kept many RAF pilots alive. Air Ace Peter Townsend constantly told his pilots, "Don't climb, don't dive, just turn." When the Luftwaffe accidentally bombed the old center of London, an outraged Churchill ordered the bombing of Berlin. Hitler, in turn, ordered the destruction of London. The Blitz actually gave the RAF the break it needed to regroup and turn the tide against the Luftwaffe. By the end of October, Hitler ceased the regular bombing of London. Only a third of the RAF fighters had been Spitfires, but she had become the signature aircraft in the Battle of Britain. This is the Mark 14 Spitfire, one of the last models to fight in World War II. It has twice the horsepower of the early Spitfires used in the Battle of Britain. According to pilot Steve Hinton, the increased performance added to her effectiveness as a fighter.
Well, I think the Spitfire differed probably from its enemy in the fact that it had just such a fantastic engine. The Rolls-Royce Griffin and Merlin engine, you know, far exceeded, I think, what the Germans had. It was capable of high horsepower at high altitude and put on a lightweight airframe like the Spitfire with a big wing and a great turning radius. You know, it was a really good combination. Spitfire had a nickname, as far as I know. Spitz is what everybody called it when you're over in England. You talk to the guys, they all say Spitz. Affectionately, of course, though. I don't know anyone who could say anything bad about a Spitfire, anyone who's ever flown one or been around one. This Mark 14 Spitfire reminds me of a small person with big muscles. This airplane has a fantastic rate of climb, and in the air it's a dream to fly. The airplane can turn on a dime, and you can do Emmelmans at 150 miles an hour, just pull the nose straight up and pull it over. I mean, it's a fantastic machine. one great claim to fame the Spitfire had is after the war, when they got all the fighters together and tested them all in England, the Mark 19 Spit was said to be the very fastest of all propeller-driven airplanes in a dive. It could exceed 0.8 Mach number. The shortcoming of that is, believe it or not, they tore the propellers right off of them on those dive tests. The wooden propellers and the whole nose case of the engine just ripped right off. I would say if anything would be a shortcoming on the airplane, in my opinion, would be just systems. But the airplane itself is just a real dream to fly.
America's new fighter, the P-38, flies a mission to Berlin. When first flight...
The American entry into the war mobilized an army of designers and builders who quickly produced an incredible range of aircraft. Everything from simple trainers to streamlined, futuristic warbirds. The P-38 was ahead of its time, a sleek, fast machine that opened the door to a new range of technical problems, like the effects of multi-engine torque and high-speed airflows. For test pilots, this airplane proved to be a dangerous challenge.
In 1937, Lockheed designers Hall Hibbard and Kelly Johnson proposed a twin-engine fighter, the P-38 Lightning. She featured twin booms to house each engine and to balance the aircraft. Much larger than a Spitfire, her twin 1,150 horsepower Allison engines gave her 413 miles per hour in level flight, 58 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire. Unfortunately, in dives, the aircraft tended to lose control. The problem proved to be compressibility. When air accelerating over the wing broke the sound barrier, it created a shock wave over her tail. The loss of control left the pilot all but helpless. Other planes would soon encounter this problem, as recalled by American ace Robert Johnson in his P-47. No man was strong enough to pull the fighter out of a compressibility dive. I've gripped the control stick in both hands, jammed my feet against the instrument panel for leverage, and hauled back with all the strength I had. The stick might have been embedded in concrete for all the good the frantic pulling did me. The solution for the P-38 proved to be a dive flap that changed the flow of air around the wing. This 1-by-5-foot flap did the trick. The Lightning was the first American fighter to enter the European theater. Her long range was ideal for convoy patrols in the North Atlantic. It was on such a mission that a P-38 shot down an FW-200 bomber, the first kill after the U.S. entry into the war. Other P-38s flew all the way to England for daylight bomber escort missions over Europe. Able to stay aloft for the long hours required on such missions, she was a welcome companion for the B-17. The P-38 was the first fighter escort on a bombing mission to Berlin. Sustained high-altitude flying introduced new problems for the P-38. Hastily designed in the comfortable, dry climate of California, cockpit heaters and window defrosters had to be installed. Early oxygen systems left much to be desired. And turbochargers supplied by the Army were mismatched for the engines. This led to engine failures after only a few hours at high altitude. Still, the P-38 proved the value of long-range bomber escorts. But the same turbochargers which damaged engines at high altitudes performed well at sea level. The P-38 was an extraordinary ground attack fighter. It was in this use that the P-38 made her mark. Armed with both cannon and machine guns, like the German 109, the P-38 was overwhelming. The Germans called her Der Gabelschwanzteufel, or fork-tailed devil, and her long range let her bring the battle to the Germans. The P-38 enjoyed many firsts. She was the first fighter with twin engines, turbochargers, and tricycle landing gear. Her long-range ability made her the first fighter to fly the Atlantic for delivery to the European theater. She was the first fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour and to encounter and outwit compressibility. In fact, it was the P-38 that served Ace Major Richard Bong in the Pacific Theater. She was indeed a fork-tailed devil. The Planes of Fame Air Museum in Chino, California has a P-38 in its collection of fully restored warbirds. Of the nearly 10,000 that were built, this is one of the last existing in flying condition. It took 14 months to rebuild, and it's one of pilot Steve Hinton's favorite aircraft.
The airplane is on the leading edge of design. Everything from the engine designs, turbo supercharger systems, and structures of the airplane were way ahead of their time and not really contemporary with other airplanes of that era. You don't get the engine heat in the cockpit like you do in some of the other airplanes. And the controls are really balanced real well. P-38 was really one of the first planes flying that had to deal with compressibility. You know, the problem of supersonic airflow over the wings. And in this particular airplane, it was a problem with the nose tuck. In other words, at these high speeds that they encountered, the nose of the airplane would want to pitch down. And the natural tendency for the pilot was to pull back to pull the nose up. But that actually didn't fix the problem until they got down to the lower altitudes when the air was thick enough.
This particular P-38 is a Model J. Nearly 3,000 were built toward the end of the war. The Model J was a long-range version capable of flying 2,600 miles. This one was originally built as a fighter with a standard armament of one 20-millimeter cannon and 4 50-caliber machine guns. Other P-38s were configured as light bombers, torpedo carriers, night fighters, tank busters, smoke screen layers, and photo reconnaissance aircraft. The P-38 was the only American fighter in production on the first and last day of the war.
The air war over Europe entered a new phase when American industry geared up for the challenge. Suddenly, a new generation of fighters took to the sky, and Americans quickly entered the competition for the world's best fighter, one that was faster and carried more armament than anything else in the sky.
With victory in North Africa, the Allies would soon find themselves battling the European Axis powers on the Italian and Russian fronts. In spite of broad defensive lines, the Germans and Italians were holding their own. To crush them, a third front was required in Western Europe. After lengthy preparations, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. It began on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Air superiority was essential for the success of the invasion. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, promised his men, if you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours. His promise was kept. Air superiority had been hard won. Over the years leading up to the invasion, the Allies had perfected their air strategies and developed the aircraft necessary to make them one of the most formidable air powers of their day. A key part of the Allied strategy was the round-the-clock bombing of German industrial targets throughout Europe. The American B-17 Flying Fortress was used for daytime bombing. Although heavily armed with machine guns, the number of B-17 losses were appallingly high without fighter escorts. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Spitfires were among the first escort aircraft, but their limited range did not allow them to fly far into Germany. As a consequence, bomber losses were as high as 200 planes and 2,000 men a week. The introduction of the P-38 Lightning did extend fighter escort range into central Germany. Although an improvement, even greater range was needed to reach Berlin. The answer was the P-51 Mustang. She not only flew long, but she flew well. The Mustang outperformed the German Me-109 and let the Americans exercise more aggressive tactics. Another important air strategy for the Allies was perfecting air-ground coordination. With the introduction of P-51s for escort duty, P-38s and P-47s were used increasingly for ground attacks, clearing the path for soldiers down below. General George S. Patton said of the relationship between air cover and ground forces that it was a case of love at first sight. Serendipity is often a part of great inventions, and this is true for both the P-47 and the P-51. The P-47 was originally designed as a high-altitude fighter, but earned its greatest reputation for ground support. The P-51 was used as a dive bomber for 6 months before its potential for high-altitude escort was discovered. As these aircraft settled into their most appropriate roles, the Allies began to gain momentum.
P-51, or Mustang, as it was often affectionately called, was originally built in America for the RAF. The high-speed fighter turned out to be such an efficient aircraft that the Americans also built thousands for themselves. When it went into combat in 1943, it sealed the fate of the German Luftwaffe.
In early 1940, the British government approached the president of North American Aviation, Dutch Kindleberger, with a request to produce Curtiss P-40s. Dutch politely counteroffered with a proposal to deliver an all-new aircraft that would outfly the P-40. The British accepted and bet Dutch that he couldn't deliver it in 120 days. Dutch delivered his first P-51 Mustang airframe in just 117 days. It was a sleek aircraft utilizing the latest in wing designs. It carried up to 8 machine guns and flew 25 miles per hour faster than the P-40. This first version was limited by its Allison engine, which worked best at altitudes below 15,000 feet. For this reason, the first P-51s were used for reconnaissance and dive bombing. In November 1942, the RAF experimented with putting a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the P-51, the same engine used in the Spitfire. The transformation was stunning. The Merlin added over 50 miles per hour to the Mustang, doubled its range, and made it fully operational at high altitude. This new P-51 helped change the course of the air war. For the first time, bombers could be escorted all the way to Berlin and back. The performance of the Mustang was so exceptional that new tactics evolved. No longer did fighter escorts stick with their bombers. As General Meyer of the Army Air Force put it, "We did a better job at defending the bombers by getting out further away from them, where we could engage the fighters before they had a chance to get in so close." Mustangs also attacked the Luftwaffe while they were still on their runways. German air ace Adolf Galland admitted that the fatal turn in the war for the Luftwaffe was the switch from close bomber defense to the offense. One of the most impressive things about the P-51 is its mystique. Many pilots continue to restore old P-51s or to build them from prefabricated kits. Kevin Eldridge is an aviation restoration expert with the Planes of Fame Museum in California.
When you think about the Mustang, it kind of has a temperamental image. One day it could run really good, the next day it might not run so good. As far as the engine goes, being a V12 liquid-cooled, it's a little more temperamental than a radial engine, say in the Corsair would be. But when she's performing, she's really good. It's nice and smooth.
Like many warbirds, this particular P-51 was assembled from the parts of several aircraft. The airframe is part of the famous P-51 racer, the Red Baron. In 1979, pilot Steve Hinton set a world speed record in the Red Baron for propeller-driven, piston-powered aircraft, a record that was to stand for 10 years. Recorded speed records date back to the Wright brothers, and include pilots such as Howard Hughes and Jimmy Doolin. The Planes of Fame Museum also has a P-51A. This was the model with an Allison engine that was originally delivered to the British. The museum acquired this aircraft in 1957 and eventually restored it to flying condition in 1981. Here again is pilot Kevin Eldridge.
As far as handling one of these planes, it's a real jewel to fly. It's light on the controls, real responsive. It's a really smooth running aircraft, and you feel really snug in the cockpit, so it feels like you are a part of the plane.
Flying high and flying low, the Thunderbolt conquers the enemy.
One simple solution for a better, faster fighter was to increase its power, adding hundreds or even thousands of horsepower. That idea produced the P-47, the Thunderbolt, often claimed to be the fastest fighter of the war.
In June of 1940, the United States Army Air Force asked several manufacturers to develop an aircraft capable of 400 miles per hour with a 40,000-foot ceiling. Republic Aircraft put their chief designer, Alexander Cartvelli, to work on a proposal. Cartvelli had worked with Blériot in France and Fokker Aircraft of America before joining Republic. He was already respected for his work designing the P-35. The specifications for this new aircraft were demanding. It had to be fast, in spite of the increased weight of armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 8 50-caliber machine guns. Cartvelli's solution was a solid, sturdy design powered by a huge 2,000 horsepower radial engine. On May 6, 1941, when the P-47 completed its maiden flight, test pilot Lowry Brabham jumped from the cockpit and said, "We've got a winner." But that was the last thing combat pilots in Britain thought when seeing their first P-47s. They were accustomed to their sleek Spitfires. On the ground, the 6 tons of Thunderbolt didn't look promising. But in the air, it was a different story. The P-47 sped along at 420 miles per hour. On escort missions, the 8 machine guns of the P-47 were very effective. It was soon discovered that the Thunderbolt had a flair for diving attacks. No German aircraft could outrun her in a dive. As P-47s were gradually replaced by P-51s for escort duty, military command put her to work as a dive bomber. Here, the P-47 came into her own as a ground attack fighter. In March of 1944, P-47s began regular attacks on transportation and communication targets in preparation for the D-Day invasion. This was a new type of aerial warfare, and pilots took an active role in developing strategy for ground attacks. Military convoys, airfields, tank columns, bridges, and trains were common targets. After After D-Day, the Thunderbolt found a new role in coordinated air-ground attack. Experience in North Africa had proven the value of close air support for ground troops. As Allied forces made their way through France and into Germany, the Thunderbolt fought at treetop level, clearing military obstacles for foot soldiers and friendly tank columns. The Thunderbolt was famous for the amount of punishment it could absorb. Damage that would destroy other aircraft didn't stop the P-47. On one escort mission, Ace Robert S. Johnson's P-47 absorbed 21 hits from 20mm cannon fire and 100 machine gun rounds before returning safely. Thanks to Cartvelli's design, the P-47 could be modified for a variety of tasks. In all, 22 modifications were made over the course of the war. The M version was a high-speed, low-altitude interceptor designed to destroy German B-1 buzz bombs. And the J version was the first fighter to achieve speeds over 500 miles per hour. The P-47 was one of the first true multi-role fighters, performing as well on the deck as in the stratosphere. Like most World War II aircraft, only a few P-47s are in flying condition today. Here in the cockpit of a Planes of Fame P-47 is racing pilot Steve Hinton.
P-47 always brought its guy home. Looking in the history books and talking to the pilots that flew them, you know, it could sustain a lot of damage. I've seen pictures of these things with the propeller blades bent. You know, the airplane flying through trees. You know, they used it for a lot of ground attack towards the end of the war when the Mustangs and some of the other airplanes fulfilled the fighter escort role better. They put the Thunderbolts to the ground strafing role, and with that big air-cooled engine and armor plate the airplane had, the big 8 machine guns. I mean, it was a real formidable weapon, and it could take a lot of punishment without getting knocked down. The Thunderbolt's a pretty easy airplane to fly compared to some of the other ones. It's got a real wide landing gear. And when you touch down, it tracks nice and straight down the runway. Handling qualities in the air are real nice, has real nice control pressures. They're real even and balanced. The P-47 really didn't have a lot of major problems in this development. The biggest problem it had early on when it came out, it didn't have an inline engine. The thinking in those days, a pursuit airplane had to have an inline engine. That was what they were pushing for. But the performance numbers that the airplane generated just outdid those early requirements. The airplane is not real fast, or doesn't give you the sensation of speed like a P-51 does, or a Spitfire, or a Bearcat, or a Corsair, but it dives real good. It did really good because it was so big and had such great guns. You know, it has 8 machine guns on the thing. Pilots said it was easy to aim, easy to shoot, and also provided a lot of protection for the pilot. Well, the P-47 really is very docile in a stall and a turn. I don't think it really has any bad qualities. Different than maybe some of the other airplanes. You might say the only thing that comes to mind is the sink rate. If you were to close the throttle on landing with full flaps at a high altitude and slow down, it really comes out of the sky. But as far as an image goes, just a big, comfortable airplane to fly. Roomy and smooth, real smooth to run an airplane.